that a music biography, let's call it, are somewhere between 125,000 and 150,000 words. Brad and Chris's book is probably somewhere around that. You've seen them. They're kind of about an inch in terms of the pages. They form about an inch. My book was 250,000 words. It's about 500 pages. So publishers saw that, or I told them that, and they said, well, there's no way we can publish a book that long. So they wouldn't even touch it. They wouldn't go near it. So as I'm writing, I'm thinking, I know this is a long book, and, I'll go back and I'll edit parts out. And I thought, well, fuck it. It's my book. Even before I gave it to the publishers, I thought, I'm going to leave it all in there. Let me finish it. Let me leave it all in there. Stuff really seems extraneous. I'll take it out. So It's a very long book. I am self-publishing. I don't know anything about self-publishing. I'm guessing the turnaround time from the point when a publisher would actually have the download. I guess you send the stuff to them on a hard drive. I'm sure it's like a digital thing. And then they lay out the books somehow. They print the books. I really don't know anything about that. I mean, I'm guessing. It has to be like 4 to 6 week turnaround. I do have an art director working with me, a guy named Daniel Gray. Daniel has done like some huge campaigns, and he actually just worked with Neil Slozauer. Neil has a new book coming out on Ed, all the unseen photos he took of Ed. It's just unbelievable. And Daniel chose all the photos. I think Neil told him I was working on a book, and Daniel and I in talk, so he's helping with that. He's currently actually tracking down book publishers. So I would like to think that the book could be out March or April, could be May or June. In terms of where, I mean, certainly I would be getting back to you guys, and I'd be putting up postings on the Van Halen sites where to contact me. And I'll be doing some pre-sales closer to the point when I have more of a fixed idea of, a release date.
Let me ask you this. In your time with Ed and interviewing him, did you get the sense that he understood what we all saw that he had in terms of not only his own talent, but as you well know, Van Halen had an X factor to them. They were not just a great rock band. They were not just a great guitarist. They had an X factor. They had this unbelievably multi-talented musician mixed with the ultimate frontman, mixed with this solid rock foundation of Michael Anthony and Alex Van Halen with these unbelievable harmonies. There's just so many different elements of Van Halen that really created a blueprint for a generation. Van Halen was definitely the band that was a bridge from the 70s to the 80s. They had one foot in the 70s and one foot in the 80s, and they were definitely the bridge to rock music from coming out of the whole 70s haze and into the 80s. If you look at the lineage of the albums, they really made that transition. Do you think that Ed had even that perspective of what his band was doing, or do you think he was just way too in tuned to his own musicianship to even see the forest through the trees?
That is a beautiful question, Dave, and that's one that I tried to answer over and over in the book, various points in conversations when I would say something to Ed, and I'd just be blown away by something. And his response was always, it's so difficult to explain. I actually write about it more concisely. I don't think that Edward ever had a sense of his own influence and legacy, legend, this thing that he created. I really, truly believe that. On the other side of that is not to say that he did not know and was absolutely 1,000% secure in who he was as a guitar player. But the thing with Ed is I never, ever heard Ed say, dude, those are the fucking best solos you've ever heard, right? He never talked like that.
Right.
And if I said, Ed, my God, Ed, you're playing on the Fair Warning record was just fucking amazing. When I'd allow myself to become a fan, and he'd go, yeah, he dismissed it. He wasn't embarrassed by it, but it meant nothing to him. And I mean, that is a rare thing to find.
Yeah.
Like I said, I have talked to, the greatest guitar players on the planet. I've interviewed Jeff Beck and Page and Townsend and Blackmore and Peter Frampton and Steve Morse and Lukather. I mean, you just don't get that sense from those guys. I mean, not that they would say, hey, I'm the fucking best guitar player on the planet, but it was always different. So in trying to answer your question directly, Dave, I don't think Ed ever had a sense of who he was. I don't think he never had any kind of a blueprint or plan for what Van Halen did. Because I used to ask him, I said, Ed, man, the second record, man, really sounds like, your songwriting got better. And he'd just say, yeah, well, I've just been doing it. He never looked at it and tried to think about it in that way. I don't think he ever had a sense of, that chemistry between himself and Dave and Mike and his brother. I mean, he talked about his brother a lot. With Ed, it was always he and his brother. From very early on, and I mean way earlier than people think, Ed had real problems with Dave and Mike. At the time when Ed was telling me these things, nobody knew about that stuff then,
right?
Because it wasn't out there. And that was the kind of stuff I'd never write about. And I think that was later when I asked him about the book. I don't think he even thought that, he never came out and said it, but I could tell by his conversation. I don't think he thought there was anything. Why do you want to write a book about me? He never said that, but that's what kind of came out in sort of his denials of allowing me to write the book, Said, yeah, like a career is over, and I probably talk about it in the book. Yeah, he thought if the book came out, like that would be all he had. And he explained this to me a couple times, and it went so deep and it was so dark. And I'm not going to give it away because you're going to have to read the book.
Sure, of course, yeah.
But, and look, I'm not trying to be a tease here, but...
No, it's all cool. Really, we understand.
I really do explain it better in the book.
Yeah, no, of course.
But it was so deep and dark, what he said to me at that point in time. I mean, right after the 84 record came out, that, arguably, I know a lot of people love the first record, but Jesus Christ, from terms of his songwriting and the sound of the record...
Yeah.
And his arranging, 1984, that is an absolute breakthrough record. And that, to me, was sort of the beginning of Van Halen Mach 2. After that record came out, and, before he did the Sammy record, you think, oh, my God, this is the perfect time. I said, Ed, now's the perfect time, man. Because I knew Sammy. I knew he was working with Sammy. I think it was before, the world would know about Sammy. And he said, he had told me a couple times that, he loved working with Sammy, and Sammy was his brother. And, I said, Ed, before the Sammy thing begins, great, man, let's do the book in 2 parts. I said, the first part could be you, through 1984. And he goes, no. It should be me, and the first record was Sammy, and then we have something to continue with the second book. I go, yeah, man, that's great. That's perfect. So, for that brief instant, he got it. And I know I'm jumping subjects here.
No, that's okay. That's okay.
After 1984, he's sitting on top of the world, right? Is there another band in the universe as revered and as important as Van Halen after the 1984 record comes out? I don't know. What were the Stones doing? Certainly not,
right.
Zeppelin really weren't doing anything. U2, I don't know.
How would you describe the dynamic between Dave and Ed? Because we're fans, we just see what we see from the fans. And how did you perceive it from your perspective, from the inside of being Ed's friend? What did you see? There obviously is a yin and yang between them that creates an unbelievable spark that is really unrivaled. There's a sweet and sour, there's a yin and yang, there is something that is created between Dave and Ed, and then obviously with Mike and Alex in the mix. But there's a flavor that it's created that is nothing like anything else. We see that from the fan perspective, but how did you see it from your perspective, their relationship and their dynamic?
I guess the big question was, if Dave hadn't been the singer and Ed had found another singer, that's an impossible question to ask. And I don't even try to address that in the book. Dave needed Edward infinitely more. That's my opinion. And,
okay.
And some of the things I say in the book are going to piss off fans who love Dave, and I get it. And I could have left my own comments out, during the course of an interview. I could have lied and changed it, but I wasn't going to do that, If I was going to lay it out there and be honest with myself, and that was really important, I had to let people understand, where I came from. So, I know this is going to anger people, and purely from my own taste, I was never a fan of Dave. I didn't think Dave was a great singer. I thought lyrically, he did some interesting things. However, there was no denying that spark on stage that happened between them. That being said, from early on, Ed would tell me things as much as Dave did in the band, and Dave's input in the band was extraordinary. Besides writing lyrics, and melodies, a lot of those, the marketing ideas and, the look and stuff. Although Ed told me that a lot of that came from Alex as well, designing album covers. And again, this is stuff that, you and your listeners may know.
Sure.
But a lot of that came from Al as well. Ed always gave Dave props in terms of his participation. But at a point in time, and probably towards 1984, when it became really apparent, Dave wanted to be a solo artist. And Dave did things and said things to Edward that were disrespectful. As much as Dave loved the band, Dave never loved the band as much as Edward did. For Ed, the band was everything.
Right.
So what was that dynamic like? Ed said some harsh things about Dave many, many times to me. And my responses are, hey, I get it. I've never been a fan of Dave's either. And again, I know that's going to anger people.
That's
but
okay.
They have to understand that I had no agenda in writing this book. Unlike every other writer out there who wrote the book after Edward's passing. I'm sorry, not everyone. And I understand that. And there's nothing necessarily wrong in that, so long as the book is honest and the writer comes from a standpoint of offering something. But I have no agenda with Ed. I love the guy. I revered him. So if anything, I could have left all of that stuff out. I could have left all of those comments about Dave or Mike out. I could have left my own comments out. And, that's the kind of book you would have had. I couldn't do that. So Ed had specific gripes with Dave. Dave would go away on vacation and leave Ed sitting there having to, work on new music. I mean, there's just so many examples of it that I write about in the book.
Did you leave all of Ed's comments in that you talked about that you didn't write before, but did you put them into the book?
That's exactly right.
Okay. All right, good. So now what is his beef with Mike?
Mike would never call Ed and say, hey, man, let's jam. Mike never called him. Say, hey, man, let's hang out and, I got some bass ideas.
Okay.
Ed said Mike never came in with a single bass idea. Now, that in and of itself isn't bad because there are guys in bands who don't write. I mean, that's just the way it is, right? I mean, Charlie Watts or Bill Wyman, those guys didn't write. But, without those guys in the Stones, I mean, you don't have the Stones. But the thing with Ed that bothered Ed was Ed just wanted you to make the attempt. He just wanted you to try. He wanted you to love and work on the band as much as he did.
Okay.
And he didn't think Mike ever did that.
Okay.
And I think I knew why Mike didn't do that. And I said it to Ed. I said, Ed, you intimidate him. And he said, well, he better fucking get over intimidation. He's been in the band for 7 years. Get over it. And I said, Ed, that's not so easy,
Yeah.
And again, here's Ed not understanding, again, who he was or that thing. But Ed was being completely honest. So he said, hey, man, ain't talking about love. It's 2 fucking chords. And Ed's explaining this to me, that he explained this to Mike. He says, because Mike, it's 2 fucking chords. Just come in with some simple idea. Ed only wanted to see Mike trying, and Mike never did. Mike never came in having worked on parts. Ed had to show Mike bass parts. Ed came up with a little bass rig where he sort of isolated some bass parts he had done. I forget which album. I talk about it in the book. So Mike could actually kind of like, hear the tracks, kind of just like the bass parts isolated or the other instruments isolated. And Mike never took advantage of that. And that made Ed crazy. That was like a disrespect. That was part of the same thing with Dave. And Ed talks about these things. And I'm not trying to be an interpreter here. Ed talked about Mike's bass tone on those early records. I mean, it's non-existent. I mean, I can't hear the bass on that first record.
Okay.
You can barely hear it on the second record. And I think those things frustrated Ed, but he recognized that chemistry. I think if Ed, on any given day, if he hadn't, he talked about quitting the band really early on. He talked about replacing Mike, but he understood what that chemistry was. He wasn't stupid. You have to understand, Ed telling me these things, he would also, back up those statements by saying, I love Mike, I love Dave, I love those guys, they're my family. And he did, man. He loved them. I mean, he really did. And I think that's why it hurt so much, because he loved those guys so much, and they weren't living up to what he believed they should be living up to. And I think that hurt him terribly. I know it did. And, man, there are times on tapes and interviews, man, when he's talking about this stuff and his heart is broken, man. I mean, some of this stuff gets so intense. Oh, my God. But it just reveals this extraordinary side of him. Then for Dave to go off and do that. And, I mean, that was,
In terms of Dave going off solo, I have a bit of a theory about this. There's something a little amiss in my opinion, from all these years of reading articles after articles and studying all kinds of videos and listening